Hey pirate fans around the world. This is Port Royal Ghosts, the drowned city that still screams. Port Royal didn't just sink in 1692. It froze a pirate city in time, leaving an underwater archive and a chorus of ghosts that still echo through Jamaica's shores. Port Royal is a place where sea and history meet in a way that few sites on Earth can match. In a calm, steady voice, this story will reveal what truly sank the city, what remains below the water, which reports of voices and screams have followed the harbor for centuries, and how science and careful archaeology help explain or fail to explain those legends. The question is simple and powerful. Do those sounds come from spirits that never left, or from a city that never stopped moving beneath the waves? Port Royal mattered in pirate history for its wealth, its reputation, and its role as a crowded stage where privateers, merchants, enslaved laborers, soldiers, and sailors all crossed paths and fortunes. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. Quick fact, Port Royal sat on a sandy finger at the mouth of Kingston Harbor, a spot so perfect for trade and anchorage that ships seemed to come in on every tide. Quick fact, on June 7, 1692, the ground under the city behaved like liquid, and whole blocks slipped into the sea in moments. Quick fact, divers and archaeologists have found rooms preserved with plates, bottles, pipes, and tools still in place, as if the clock simply stopped. Quick fact, the Leaning Giddy House, tilted by a later earthquake in 1907, still shows how unstable the ground can be along this narrow spit of land. Quick fact, the most chilling stories are not about phantoms in long coats, but about sounds, bells, whispers, and strange notes underwater, heard where streets once bustled with life. Heads up on this, 2 guiding questions will keep the path clear. First, what do skilled divers and researchers actually observe in the sunken sections today? Second, where do the ghost stories come from, and what explains their persistence? By the end, evidence will carry the day calmly, step by step, without turning this rich history into a campfire tale. What does the drowned city look like from a diver's point of view? Picture sunlight filtering down in soft sheets, dust motes of sand drifting like snow. The lines of old streets emerge as low ridges and changes in the color of the seabed. Foundations sketch the outlines of shops and homes. In places, walls rise just high enough to show doorways that once opened to an alley or a courtyard. Tables and benches are no longer level. They tilt at quiet angles where the earth rolled and slipped. Clay pipes lie near shards of glass. A bottleneck peeks from the sand like a small periscope staring upward. Here and there, a preserved pocket seems to hold a single moment. A ceramic bowl resting beside a spoon. A buckle near a collapsed chest. A weight from a merchant's scale half buried but still recognizable. A diver gestures, and the silt replies with a slow drift that briefly hides everything. Then the scene returns, patient and unchanged. The calm of the water and the arrangement of simple objects make the place feel more like an archive than a graveyard. Less terror, more testimony. It is not loud. It is slow. The city tells its story with angles and textures, brick and ballast, wood and sand, always pointing back to the morning the ground loosened. Moments like this are not accidents. The preservation happened because the site went under so suddenly that daily life was sealed in by sand and still water. Organic materials, if protected from pests and waves, can last far longer than expected. The salt itself, often a difficult companion, sometimes helps by discouraging decay. The result is a frozen daily routine, an interrupted breakfast, an abandoned ledger, a door that never swung shut. Archaeologists use measured grids, careful notes, and patient hands to track these objects where they fell, because the exact position tells as much as the item itself. When a comb lies beside a small mirror, or when a stove rests near collapsed bowls, the arrangement becomes a map of behavior. This is why Port Royal feels unique. It is a city interrupted, not erased. The details are not from imagination, they are from the floor plans and footprints of real people, caught in a real event, and that in a quiet way is more powerful than any whisper in the dark. To understand why this place became such a magnet for ships and stories, a brief look back helps. The sand spit where Port Royal rose is a barrier at the entrance to one of the Caribbean's best natural harbors. It offered shelter from storms and a quick route to the sea. The water was deep enough for large vessels, and the bay offered a staging area for repairs, trade, and when wartime logic allowed, privateering. That last word matters. Privateers were not pirates in the strict legal sense. They sailed with papers from a government that wanted enemy ships harassed or captured. The line between privateer and pirate, however, moved like a wake on a windy day. Ships shifted loyalties, crews swapped captains, goods changed hands with a wink and a ledger note. In the late 17th century, Port Royal grew into a busy hive with taverns, warehouses, and markets piled along narrow lanes. Money poured in, and with it came crowds who needed food, clothing, shelter, and entertainment. Authorities tried to keep order. Preachers warned about sin. Merchants counted profits. Enslaved men, women, and children labored under force and violence to supply and build. A place that intense builds its own gravity. Port Royal had it. Names drift through the record like signal flags. Governors who wanted tax revenue and control, privateers who wanted prize money, traders who wanted quick sales, and crews who wanted pay and drink. Each group pushed and pulled the others, and the city became famous for speed, pleasure, and risk. People called it the wickedest city, a label that said more about its reputation than its average day. But reputation matters. It shapes how a catastrophe is remembered. Now comes the morning of June 7th, 1692. The time is late morning. The sun already sits high in the sky. The harbor looks ordinary at first glance. Sails out there, small boats here, a waterfront busy with errands. Then the ground begins to move. Not the gentle sway of a ship, not a small tremor. The sand spit that had always felt firm suddenly behaves like something else entirely. The grains loosen and slide. This behavior has a name in geology: liquefaction, where water-saturated sand loses strength and acts almost like a liquid when shaken. The effect is startling. Buildings that rely on packed ground now sit on something that behaves like slush. Walls tilt, floors drop. In some blocks, whole sections slump toward the water. Cracks open along the lines that used to be streets. A person steps and finds the soil moving out from under the heel. Another grabs a post and feels it lurch. Within moments, structures collapse. The waterfront, cut by wharves and warehouses, breaks apart in places and slides. People try to run, but the sand denies them the stable push they expect. The harbor, so calm for so long, becomes a stage for another shock. As the sea pulls back and then surges, a wave lifts boats and pushes debris where lanes used to be. The noises are not screams at first. They are the heavy sounds of breaking timber and falling stone. The rush of water, the rattle of goods in crates. A shop that sold cloth now spills color into the tide. A cookhouse dumps pans that clang and then settle. Everything takes on a slow forward motion, like a scene where gravity has been retuned. Why did Port Royal fail so quickly? The reason lies in its very success. The city was built fast and dense on a narrow arm of sand, created by nature, not by bedrock. As the population grew, people reclaimed edges, added weight, and cut channels. The harbor waters and low water table meant the ground beneath was wet. Earthquakes, which regularly touched Jamaica, shook that wet sand. A compacted surface became a mobile layer. When foundations lost their grip, buildings and streets followed. In a few parts of town, the land simply subsided, and the sea took the space, suddenly, not gradually. The result was not just broken houses, but a fresh shoreline dotted with roofs and timbers. The immediate aftermath brought a confusion that left deep marks in memory. People searched for family and friends. Some were trapped in air pockets. Some were swept into the harbor and rescued. Many were not found at all. Records from the time speak of losses counted not only in numbers, but in the tone of mourning. A clerk might report that a whole section fell in, which in plain terms means it slipped away. A minister might write that the ground opened and then closed like a mouth, taking a breath. Here the first seeds of later legends took root. Strange sounds often accompany collapsing structures and disturbed ground. Groans of timber, sighs of air escaping through mud, and the drumming of trapped bubbles. To shocked ears, those noises felt personal. They seemed to call out. A few voices from those weeks and months still carry across the pages of history. One account described the earth as quivering like jelly, a homespun comparison that captures what science later proved. Another account noted bells that rang without hands, swung by the motion of beams and frames. A man who searched along the new shoreline reported hearing a sound like wind in a room, likely air traveling through debris and wet sand. But he did not know that term. He only knew how it felt. A pastor recorded names of the lost and survivors with equal care and wrote lines that later readers interpreted as hints of the supernatural. Though his original purpose was comfort for the living and a record for the dead, merchants wrote of ledgers lost with their warehouses, and of price shocks that followed. None of these writers set out to fuel ghost stories, yet human minds are pattern makers. When an event is this large, the patterns stretch across generations. Quick fact: a city map from before the earthquake, once compared to dive surveys, shows with surprising accuracy which sections slipped under and how far. The northwestern part of town, busy with quays and storage, suffered severe damage. Alignments between old street names and underwater features help divers trace positions. Where a lane once ran, a shallow ridge or a foundation line still points the way. When underwater archaeologists lay grids and take measurements, they often find evidence that confirms those centuries-old descriptions. This matters for more than cartography. It explains why certain spots keep appearing in local tales, where streets ended abruptly in the sea, where wharves once stretched like fingers, and where foundations sank in clusters. Those are the zones where repeated reports of unusual sounds or sights are clustered, not because spirits prefer one alley to another, but because the physical layout still channels water and air in particular ways. It is a quiet, logical kind of mystery. The catalog of ghostly reports at Port Royal is both varied and strangely consistent. There are accounts of faint bells, though no freestanding bells ring there now. The likely cause is the movement of metal or stone under seasonal currents, or the memory of the 1692 shaking, when bells truly did swing. There are stories about voices that seem to murmur near the old waterfront, probably a mix of distant human sound bouncing over water and the way waves tunnel through the remains of wharves and cellars, breaking into audible tones. Footsteps are reported where sand and stone shift under a visitor's own weight, producing a rhythm that arrives a moment delayed as if someone followed. Whispers, again wind passing across gaps, a sound that any sailor knows can turn a rope's hum into a word shape. Lights, often reflections from boats or shore bending on ripples at night to float where no lamps stand. Cold spots, easy to explain where tidal currents bring in a long finger of cooler water from deeper parts of the harbor. None of this ruins the poetry. If anything, it gives the place a richer voice. Here is where physics meets legend, in simple terms. Underwater, sound moves faster than in air and bounces with less loss. It can curve around obstacles and turn corners. A diver might hear a tap or a scrape from a direction that makes no sense, only to find the source halfway around a wall. The human brain, trained on air, mislocates the origin. In shallow water, waves breathe in and out of hollow spaces. A trapped pocket compresses and releases. Wood can creak for years as it swells and dries with small changes in salinity and temperature. Stone can rub stone, shells can clatter. Fishing line caught on a fragment can sing its thin song when current plucks it. At the same time, expectations play a role. When a place is famous for strange sounds, small noises are noted and remembered. When the mind is calm, the explanation is heard too. When the mind is primed for mystery, the noise becomes a message. Neither response is foolish. Both are human. Underwater archaeology at Port Royal has gradually turned scattered knowledge into a coherent picture. The work is patient. A grid is laid out, lines measured, depths recorded. Divers hover rather than kneel to avoid stirring silt. Tools are simple: brushes, small trowels, sometimes low suction devices, to remove loose sand without moving larger material. Each item is mapped where it is found, given a number, photographed and lifted only when the context is fully understood. A ceramic shard has more to say if it is known where it lay and what was beside it. A bottle with residue inside can speak to what was stored. A carpenter's plane near a doorway tells about repair work or furniture making. In conservation labs, salt is slowly drawn out of wood and iron to prevent crumbling. A wooden object that might shatter into soft fibers if dried too quickly is kept wet and treated so its structure is supported as the water is replaced. This is science in service of memory, careful and calm. The finds paint a picture of daily life that is both ordinary and vivid. Bowls and spoons tell of meals served quickly to busy workers or sailors between tasks. Clay pipes, common in that era, lie in great numbers. Tiny signatures of conversation. Buttons and buckles mark clothing styles and supply networks. Imported ceramics show trade routes. Locally used wares hint at cost and habit. Coins show denominations and rulers. Weights and measures show the standards by which trade was counted. Tools show what work was done. Religious items show how people prayed. Toys indicate children's presence in lanes that are often imagined only as adult spaces. Evidence of enslaved labor appears in the very patterns of construction and the economy that drove it. The city's speed and profit leaned on forced work and the transfer of wealth and goods built on it. This is not a dark aside, it is a central fact that explains how quickly the town grew and how much money rushed through its hands. Above water, a visitor today would find landmarks that connect to the sunken city's story. Fort Charles stands with its history of defense and its view across the harbor. The Giddy House, tilted by the 1907 earthquake, offers a direct experience of unstable ground. People step inside and feel balance slip, not from any trick of fear, but from a real shift in the angle that makes the inner ear argue with the eye. The building is a later structure, but the lesson it gives is old. This is a place where the earth moves and the sand reminds every visitor that it is not bedrock. The shoreline has changed since 1692, and so have the buildings, yet the alignment between what can be seen on land and what lies below helps orient the mind. Here is the fort that watched the harbor. There is the line where crowded lanes once ran. Add a tide chart and a current map, and the ghost stories seem less like wandering tales and more like natural partners to a city that breathes water. Bringing the famous names into focus helps separate the legends from the ledger books. Privateers who made fortunes passing through Port Royal often wore two faces: legal raider during war, suspect opportunist after the papers expired. Merchants made deals with them because profit is a language spoken easily in ports. Governors cracked down in some years and looked away in others. Later writers, eager to link any pirate to any famous spot, sometimes added flourishes that do not survive contact with records. The reality is more interesting. Port Royal's power came from systems: the harbor, the trade routes, the legal gray zones, not only from a handful of colorful rogues. Still, reputations fed stories. A city known for swagger and spendthrift nights is an easy target for judgment. When it fell, those judgments were ready-made frames, and the voices that people thought they heard seemed to fit that frame. The tale grew, not because of malice, but because that is how communities explain disaster, by turning noise into meaning. Food and drink in Port Royal followed the tides of trade. Ships brought salt beef, hard biscuit, dried peas, rice and rum. Fresh water mattered most. Wells and cisterns were lifelines. Daily meals were simple when work pressed hard, and elaborate when a captain spent freely after a prize. Markets mixed imported goods with local produce. For those with money, choice was a pleasure. For the enslaved and the poor, rations were plain and sometimes short. Spoilage and pests were constant challenges. Scurvy, The disease born of vitamin C deficiency lingered where fresh fruits and greens were scarce. In crowded neighborhoods, fire and disease ran fast when given a chance. Public order kept a lid on trouble with patrols, fines, and the occasional show of force. People feared not only criminals, but the duller threats of hunger, heat, and sickness. These quiet pressures existed long before the earthquake and shaped how people reacted when the ground failed. A city under strain breaks with a different sound. The 1692 disaster did not end the story of shaking. In 1907, another major earthquake struck the region, and the effects at Port Royal added a fresh chapter. The Giddy House, once a naval storehouse, tilted and stayed that way, testimony in brick and mortar to sudden ground movement. Later storms and smaller quakes continued to test the shoreline. Each event reinforced the idea of a restless place. People talk. A neighbor tells a visitor about the day the floor felt wrong. A fisherman mentions a noise under the hull at certain tides. An old rumor gets a new frame. It must have been a spirit, someone says, because what else explains a bell tone heard where no bell swings? A younger voice answers with an explanation about currents and cavities. The two views coexist, one poetic, one physical, because both offer meaning. Over time, the story becomes not just about the past, but about how a community lives with a landscape that can tilt and breathe. To keep the discussion balanced, a clear set of comparisons helps. Take bells. In the immediate earthquake, church bells and ship bells rang because things moved them. In later years, similar tones come from chains or metallic debris reacting to water, or from small boats and buoys carrying sound along the surface. Take whispers. Wind across lines and through cracks makes familiar syllables. Anyone who has camped near a taut rope knows that song. Underwater, trapped air releases with a shape that can sound like a sigh. Take footsteps. On shifting sand, pressure waves travel under the surface and return to the ear a moment later, mimicking a second walker. Take light. Harbor reflections appear where no lamp exists, especially when a distant boat's glow bounces twice, once off the water and once off a surface below. None of these dismiss the experiences. They simply give them a place in the physical world. When explained, the mystery changes flavor. It becomes respectful curiosity rather than fear. At this point, attention turns back to the divers and the archaeologists who have written modern chapters for Port Royal's book. Surveys have traced the old town's plan with good accuracy. Teams have brought up bottles sealed with resin, coins from reigns that mark dates like a calendar, delicate wood that tells of cabinets and ship's fittings, and household items that would feel at home on any kitchen shelf. In the lab, salt leaves slowly, replaced by compounds that stabilize the material. Conservators document every stage because the treatment itself becomes part of the artifact's history. When the public sees a wooden bowl in a museum case, it is not simply wood from the 1600s, it is wood that traveled 4 centuries by the grace of water, silt, and science. Ethical work keeps the line bright. Objects are not trophies, they are teachers. The best displays give context, showing where the item lay and what it once meant to a pair of hands. In this way, Port Royal is not only a story about loss, but about learning. On the surface today, life goes on in a living town, with families, schools, and work. Heritage pride mixes with practical concerns. Tourism brings attention and income. It also brings pressure. Preservation laws protect underwater cultural heritage. Permits guide research and diving. Zero-take rules forbid removing objects without authorization. Local voices matter most in deciding how to balance access and respect. When a community leads, history feels owned rather than borrowed. In Port Royal, that leadership means valuing both the visible landmarks and the submerged archives. It means telling the full story, including the role of enslaved labor in building the wealth that made the city shine. It means inviting visitors to listen not for screams but for lessons. How a harbor can make a city, how geology can unmake it, and how people can keep memory with care. With legends laid out and physics explained, a fair verdict on the screams can be stated plainly. The most plausible sources are natural, underwater acoustics, shifting ground, and wind and water turning ordinary objects into instruments. The least plausible explanations demand angry spirits at every corner. Still, intellectual honesty leaves space for what is not yet measured. Are there sounds that puzzle even careful listeners? Yes, on occasion. Could future surveys or sensors map those noises more precisely? Certainly, an open question is not an invitation to panic. It is an invitation to study for a place like Port Royal. That is the cooler, sturdier path forward. For those drawn to explore, a few basics guide a respectful visit. Legal protections exist for a reason. They keep the site intact for future study, and for future generations who deserve to see what the sea preserved. Boats should move slowly, near sensitive areas. Divers should avoid touching or stirring silt. Nothing should be taken. Guides and local museums provide context that turns a visit from sightseeing into understanding. A careful eye on tides and weather is not just safety, it is good listening, because tide and wind are the hands that play the harbor's instruments. The more one knows about currents and shoreline, the more meaning there is in a small sound, a change of temperature, or a sway underfoot at the giddy house. In the end, why does the city still scream? Because what happened there was sudden and heavy, and the traces of that day remain in wood, brick, and sand. Water keeps secrets well, and Port Royal's secrets are not ghosts in the sense of wandering souls, but echoes shaped by physics and memory. The screams, if that word is allowed, are the groans of beams and the breath of tides speaking through rooms that once rang with trade and talk. The clearest image to hold is a simple one. A clock stopped at the moment the earth gave way, a face with hands pointed forever at late morning. It is not frightening, it is quiet. It asks for attention, not fear. Thank you is due to those who keep this story alive. The people who live there, the divers and conservators who work carefully, the teachers and guides who explain without sensationalizing, and the listeners who choose patience over panic. For those who wish to wander further, related harbors and drowned towns wait with their own lessons, some in Europe, some in the Americas, all shaped by the same mix of water, wealth, and risk. The closing lines mirror the opening promise without raising the pulse. In Port Royal, the past is not gone. It is simply in another room where sound carries differently, where the floor tilts slightly, and where a visitor with a calm ear can hear history breathing. In Port Royal, the past isn't past, it's just underwater. Sailors who once walked those streets understood the sea's moods, yet even they would have paused at the way Port Royal's drowned blocks still shape sound. Under certain tides, the harbor becomes a slow instrument. Water breathes through gaps where cellar walls met timber frames. Air compresses and releases like a lung. The soft hiss and low moan are everyday physics, dressed in atmosphere, not malice. A harbor is a choir of small things: rope, plank, shell, sand, grown articulate when wind and current press them into service. Anyone listening for a fight will hear a challenge. Anyone listening for a lesson will hear design. In this place, the lesson is that memory does not need fear to be strong. It only needs patience. Take the path of a merchant who survived and later returned to the shoreline to salvage what could be retrieved. The wharf he knew is gone. The waterline sits where an alley once ran. He looks out and imagines the grid below, a shop that stored amphora-like jars and hoop-bound barrels, a house with a small courtyard where a child once chased a stray chicken, a room where a carpenter kept a bench and a plane, tidy from habit. In his mind he hears clatter, but in his ears he hears the steady pulse of the sea. From time to time, a brighter sound appears, perhaps the faint knock of a loose stone tapping a beam when a wave lifts it just so. He cannot be blamed for calling it a bell. The tone is right, yet the sea floor is the bell, and water is the striker. Step by step, the shoreline teaches language without a single word. Port Royal, before the earthquake, had the pace of a town that always expected another ship. Sails appeared at the harbor mouth, the way distant clouds rise, and with them came news, goods, desires, and trouble. A tavern keeper planned for barrels to arrive, and for sailors to drain them. A tailor planned for prize money to be spent on bright cloth. A clerk planned for ledgers to be updated with a handful of foreign coins, then a handful more. Authorities planned for arguments, for the occasional brawl, for the need to put out fires and keep the peace with patrols. Much of the work that made these plans possible was done by enslaved people, unfree hands, carrying water, moving cargo, cooking food, repairing structures, and receiving hardship in return. The wealth that made Port Royal famous traveled through their bodies as heat and effort. It is essential to keep that fact present, because the city's speed and shine rested on a base of forced labor. A visitor who walked the lanes would have seen narrow fronts with deep interiors as buildings squeezed close to the street. A carpenter's sign might swing above a doorway carved with simple moldings. A bakery's heat would drift into the lane in the morning, and loaf crusts would crackle when carried out. The market might offer fruit, fish, salted meat, and dried peas in sacks, with twisted mouths tied by a quick knot. Shouts and calls, familiar to any port, would mark the hours. The harbor's geometry drew the world in, and that world left traces in the objects now found below. Dutch or English ceramics, Spanish coins, glass bottles with shapes that tell of their origin, and iron tools that once cleaned and stabilized hold the marks of a hand that filed and hammered them. Each piece is simple and sufficient. Each piece is a small argument against forgetting. So it matters that when the earthquake struck, the failure was not of character, but of ground. The sand spit, sometimes called the palisados, looked solid because it had been solid enough for years. Bridges of habit had been built upon it, but saturated sands do not need much pushing to lose strength. In clearer words, when the earth shakes, wet sand can behave like a liquid, and everything on top can begin to slide or sink. Wooden pilings that bit into a packed base suddenly stood in something that flowed around them. A wall that leaned a degree or two before now leaned 5, then 10, then more, until the weakness exceeded the balance. Add the wave action of a sea that rises to meet such a failure, and blocks that faced the water found the water facing them back. Reports from that day mention the earth opening and shutting, which likely describes cracks that widened and then pinched as pressure changed underfoot. People stepped across a gap one moment and found no gap the next. Others stepped where their eyes remembered ground and found water taking their knees. These rhythms imprint the mind. Later, when the harbor breathed in small ways, those present recognized a kinship with that earlier breathing and named it with the words they had: sigh, groan, murmur, whisper. The vocabulary of sound shifted into the vocabulary of haunting without anyone intending it. Ships that had been at anchor in the harbor witnessed the scene with a different perspective. The piloting channels, familiar by feel, were altered by the event in ways that captains would later chart. Debris floated. Timbers planed smooth by years of use now planed again by water. Roof shingles, dark with tar and then darker with seawater. Goods of every kind making their last short voyages. Boats went out to rescue as many as possible. Some were pulled from floating wreckage. Some had survived in pockets of air in partially submerged structures. Stories recorded in the weeks after mentioned kindness and haste, sorrow and confusion. In the middle of a port known for speed and appetite, time slowed down and sharpened. In the weeks that followed, order tried to reassert itself. Surviving authorities assessed damage, organized relief, and confronted disease. A destroyed city does not simply lie still. It continues to interact with weather, with wildlife, with the movements of people who remained. The harbor carried pieces of the town along its edges, and returned some of them with tides. Shorebirds stood where persons once walked. The boundaries of danger shifted daily as debris settled. If a listener, calm and deliberate, stood by the waterline on a still evening, the ordinary sounds of a living shoreline would rise and fall. Insects, soft wavelets, a distant oar, the low breath of wind as it slides past an angled surface. In the hush, Memory and physics can become one thing without anyone having to force them together. To orient the sunken map, imagine standing near the fort that guarded the western approach. From there, lines once ran toward the denser quarters by the waterfront. The earthquake and accompanying slumping took large bites from those blocks. The older street plan, reconstructed from documents and compared against underwater surveys, aligns in revealing ways. Where a road is marked on paper, a change in seafloor texture often marks it underwater. Where a row of buildings stood, divers sometimes see foundations stepping like a low, uneven staircase. These correspondences allowed teams to focus on small sections and recover time capsules of daily life. When a shelf collapsed forward but its contents remained near, the table of someone's morning became a lesson table for later students. Cold spots reported by visitors can be described without any need for mystery. The harbor trades layers of water. Wind and tide can carry a stripe of cooler water that curls along the bottom edge of the spit and slips over the feet of anyone walking in the shallows, where submerged structures shape the flow. Eddies draw deeper water up. A person feeling a sudden cool swirl over the ankles might gasp, not from fright, but from surprise. A guide might smile and name the effect. A storyteller might give it a different name. Both are trying to make sense for their audience. One explanation is rooted in thermodynamics and topography. The other is rooted in memory and mood. Both can live in the same harbor without conflict, as long as the truth is not injured. Another quiet source of sound in warm, shallow waters comes from living creatures. Snapping shrimp make tiny crackles that, en masse, fill the soundscape with a faint hiss and pop. Certain fish produce calling sounds that, to a diver, feel like pulses on a drum in the background. These are not supernatural. They are the voices, the literal voices, of small animals doing what their species have done for eons. In a place like Port Royal, where people arrive primed to listen, these natural choirs sometimes get recruited into the rumor mill. It is normal. It is also a gentle reminder that not every speaker in a ghost tale is human. In conservation labs where recovered items rest, the process is unhurried. Iron objects are stabilized to remove salts that would cause them to bloom into rust again. Wood is bathed so that, molecule by molecule, water can be replaced and the structure supported. Leather is coaxed back into a condition where it will not crack at the next touch. Professionals record every step, because the history of an object after discovery is also part of its story. Through that care, a city that went down fast rises slowly, object by object, into view for a visitor at a museum or an exhibition. A pipe that lay by a doorway goes into a case with a note that tells where the doorway stood. A small cup carries resinous residue that speaks to what it held. The resonance may feel like time travel. In truth, it is the opposite. It is time standing where it should, while patience walks up to meet it. Currency at Port Royal, before the earthquake, included a mix of coinage collected from wherever trade brought it. English, Spanish, Dutch, and the values were understood through common practice. Larger payments were made in kind, in goods, in credit recorded by pen and page. A weight used in a merchant's office might be found underwater now, smooth as a river stone until cleaned and revealing markings that speak the language of commerce. A set of scales, a set of nested weights, a cluster of seals or stamps. These were the infrastructure of trust in trade, the thousand small assurances that allowed strangers to transact quickly in a crowded port. Underwater, these objects rest in quiet positions where hands left them on a day no one planned to be the last. Architecture in the sunken sections tells its own story. The ways bricks were laid, the ways timber frames were joined, the ways stair risers were measured. Patterns appear that link one building to another and to practices in other ports. Ship timbers sometimes went into land buildings. Reuse was normal in a world where material traveled. That reuse shows in the tool marks, in the angles of cuts that were once meant for a keel and ended up as a lintel. In the same way, rubble from collapsed structures sometimes found a second life in repairs made after smaller shocks or storms before the Great Earthquake. All of this apparent trivia adds to a picture of a town that was practical and quick-footed, a town that used what it had the way a sailor uses a length of rope to solve a problem and keep moving. Names associated with Port Royal's dramatic era sometimes cloud more than they clarify. Famous captains who spent time there did not always define the city, though they took up space in the later imagination. The truth that historians find is both steadier and more revealing. Port Royal's character came from trade winds, war, law, and geography, weaving a pattern too complex for a single biography to explain. Privateers with letters of marque shifted from national hero to suspect figure as treaties ended and governments changed their needs. Merchants who did well in one season might do poorly the next. A governor who cracked down one month might relax the next, if money and politics drifted that way. The legend writers later created arcs of sin and judgment. The record shows a mesh of incentives and risks that shaped everything from how a harbor pilot set his rates to how a preacher chose a sermon text. Everyday life was a threadwork of the necessary and the desired. Food had to be secured, water had to be safe, illness had to be managed. Households cooked porridge and stews that could feed many with few ingredients. Bread and biscuit carried people through long days. Meat preserved in salt needed careful soaking. Fish caught fresh needed quick use. When money flowed into town after a prize capture, choices expanded and cooks could combine imports with local goods for festive tables. But for the many who served rather than bought, meals remained simple. The city's appetite for labor meant that enslaved persons were everywhere and rarely named. Their presence can be felt in the stamina required to move casks, in the skill required to build and repair, in the endurance required to keep services running, while others spent coin in taverns. That reality moved under the glitter the way a current moves under a sunlit surface. Public order relied on watchmen, on timely intervention, and on the shared understanding that trade cannot tolerate chaos for long. Fires were a constant risk where wood, pitch, and cloth lived together. Buckets and lines of people did their best when sparks caught. Disease was a constant companion in crowded quarters. Fevers came in cycles, waterborne illnesses ran through neighborhoods, and hope often rested on breezes and prayers as much as on remedies. A place so tuned to supply and demand would later turn those same habits toward rebuilding elsewhere. Kingston across the water grew in importance as Port Royal's damaged sections settled into their new underwater home. The harbor did not empty, it reorganized. To those asking about the earthquake in 1907, the answer has layers. It was not the same event as 1692, but it awakened similar lessons. The leaning, giddy house, once a storeroom for naval equipment, did not fall. It tilted. Visitors stepping inside report a sensation of dizziness, not because of ghosts whispering, but because the brain tries to reconcile angled walls with a sense of gravity. The structure functions as a simple science exhibit without meaning to, showing how much the body relies on visual cues for balance. That tilt also reminds anyone who cares to notice that the ground here is not anchored on ancient rock. It is young, shifting material shaped by waves and wind. Build on such land, and the land will keep talking. It may whisper on calm days, it may raise its voice on others. Against this background, ghost reports look less like violations of nature and more like a kind of folk science. A community's running commentary on a restless place. The catalog remains consistent. Bells without towers, voices without bodies, steps without walkers, lights without lamps, cold without wind. When placed beside explanations grounded in acoustics and environment, the accounts do not need to be mocked to be understood. They can be honored as the way people knit past and present. The harbor lends itself to metaphor. It breathes, it remembers, it sings. Saying so is not superstitious. It is poetic shorthand for longer sentences about physics and history. And because human minds like brevity when hearts are full, the shorthand stays. One should deepen an understanding of underwater sound at Port Royal. A few simple principles can be kept at hand. Sound moves faster in water than in air, roughly 4 times as fast, which changes how echoes and directions are perceived. The human brain, trained by a lifetime of air sound cues, struggles to place an underwater sound source. Seawater layers of different temperatures and salinities can bend sound waves, guiding them around obstacles and along channels. Cavities, rooms, boxes, gaps under fallen walls can behave like resonators, turning low, broad vibrations into tones. Even gentle wave action can pump such cavities, producing steady, organ-like notes. Small bubbles rising through a tight crack generate sequences of plinks that at distance combine into something like speech. Most people have experienced this in a bathtub or a bottle. Scale it up and slow it down, and the effect is familiar. At night, when a listener stands by the water and all other noise has gone still, reflections of lights ahead can perform tricks. A boat's lamp casts a thread on the water. The thread wobbles, and the wobble appears to move laterally across dark water where no vessel sits. On humid nights, a halo around a light can float larger than the source, especially when seen at a low angle. In the 19th and 20th centuries, before electric light was common, faint flames and lantern glows could be carried on waves in ways that made them seem to detach and travel. With electricity, the distance of a light increases, and so do the opportunities for reflection. A quiet shore invites the eye to make stories. Eye and ear do this together more often than most people realize. The ethical side of Port Royal's story, how to approach and preserve, resides not only in formal policy, but in attitude. A respectful guest in this history listens first, asks questions, follows local guidance, and resists the urge to pocket anything as a souvenir. What the sea has kept is not loot, it is a library. The best divers treat the site like a reading room, where the rule is to leave everything as found, unless under approved research. Boats maintain safe speeds to reduce wake impact against sensitive edges. Guides interpret phenomena, not with drama, but with clarity. When visitors come with curiosity instead of conquest, the city is generous in return, giving up details through textures and patient repetition. The effects of slavery on Port Royal's growth demand straightforward acknowledgement. Enslaved Africans and their descendants fueled the building, the provisioning, the labor market, and the profits that made the city an economic node. On the water, they rowed, lifted, repaired. On land, they constructed, cooked, cleaned, fetched, carried, endured. That endurance allowed a merchant to sell faster, a ship to turn around more quickly, a household to shine when company came. It is easy, in the romance of pirate stories, to forget the background. The background here is human lives pressed into service without consent. This reality changes how the city's prosperity is understood and how its loss is grieved. A broad audience can hold both truths at once: the thrill of a harbor alive with ships, and the sober knowledge of who paid the hidden costs. As the 20th century went on, scholarly work at Port Royal made the site a landmark in underwater archaeology. Techniques refined here: systematic grid mapping, in situ documentation, cautious lifting, careful conservation, set standards used elsewhere. New tools entered the kit: side-scan sonar to create images of the seafloor, sub-bottom profilers to sense buried structures, photogrammetry to build detailed 3D models from overlapping images. These tools do not add spectacle, they add data. A video of a diver hovering inches above a brick floor cannot capture the same fine shape as a model that records depth to the millimeter. When models are aligned with old maps, the confidence of placement grows, and the narrative can be told with specificity that respects both the living community and the dead. The community's voice remains the compass. Port Royal is not a museum only. It is a town. Families live there. Children go to school there. Fishermen and tour guides and shop workers move through their days there. Pride in heritage matters, as does income from visitors who come to learn. Balancing preservation with development is a living conversation, not a slogan. Decisions about access, should be led by those who call the place home. They are the ones who carry the story forward when cameras leave. Their accounts, their memories, and their perspectives shape the meaning of every artifact lifted and every story told. In this calm script, the aim is to keep that balance audible. A steady respect for the local frame alongside the wider frame of Caribbean and global history. When explaining why the legend persists, the drowned city that still screams, it helps to hold two images in mind at once. One is the suddenness of the 1692 event, a morning that became a catastrophe in minutes, a community hurled into another medium. The other is the duration of the aftermath. Centuries of small movements, small sounds, and small retellings. The shock is a spark. The long hearing is a slow burn. Most people lean toward one kind of story or the other, either the Big Bang or the long echo. Yet Port Royal is both. It is the instant when a clock stops and the long afternoon, when someone in another room hears a faint ticking and wonders where it comes from. The assurance given here is that both experiences are true to the place. Evidence-based verdicts do not destroy wonder. In a museum, a child stands before a case and sees a cup someone used in the 17th century. The child does not know the brine chemistry or the polymer used in conservation. The child feels the time-distance collapse. That feeling is not a ghost, but it is close family to one. The harbor, too, allows such honest astonishments. A wave lifts, a tone sounds from somewhere under the surface. A breath seems to pass. When told that physics and structure explain it, the moment does not dim. It gains density. Now the listener knows the harbor has a mechanism and a memory. The reverence shifts from a vague fear to a precise gratitude. Descriptions of Fort Charles and the shore align with this gentle approach. A walk along the parapets calls up the harbor's geometry. The walls were built to resist attack from ships, not to resist the earth under them. The fort's endurance, with repairs and changes, makes it a link between eras. Its angles and embrasures tell of a time when cannon's range and the wind's direction mattered to daily strategy. A guide may pause by a view and say that beyond this line, a street once ran below this water, a foundation starts. Visitors nod, not because they can see it, but because the alignment of structures above and below has been explained. Clarity is a balm. Now to the recurring claim about bells. Many ports of that age kept bells for calling meetings, marking hours, or sounding alarms. Fire, attack, storm. In quake conditions, suspended masses do what pendulums do. They swing when their supports move. There is good reason that bells rang on June 7, 1692. And immediately after, the later bell-like sounds come from the seafloor, acting as a kind of vast, irregular chime. When moving water sets a slab to touching and separating from another piece, the result can sound like a dull bell. Underwater, that tone carries far and is hard to locate. So while no tower rises from the water to hold a bell, the harbor has a way to make that sound anyway. For a listener ready to be fair, the dual explanation can be satisfying. Bells did ring. Bell-like tones still occur for reasons that can be tested. Survivor records help to ground the narrative in voices. One account described a street's end foundered away, a phrase that takes a sailor's word for a ship going down and applies it to land. Another observed that sand rose in bubbles where the ground cracked and water pushed up, a good description of liquefaction that reads like straight observation. A community leader noted that men were seen carried out by the sea and again brought in alive, a detail that likely refers to the back and forth of waves after a seafloor shift. Words like these, repeated and copied in the decades afterward, took on shades of meaning. A later reader might emphasize the uncanny. The original writer meant to record, in every case the closer one stands to the event's time, the plainer the language tends to be. That plainness is instructive. For those who hope to visit, there is practical advice that keeps the chill museum-like tone intact. Arranging time with local guides and museums adds context. Checking on legal requirements avoids harm. Understanding that zero-take rules exist to preserve the site makes one a partner, not a liability. Reading a little beforehand about the harbor's shape, the street plan, and the kinds of objects found turns the ground underfoot into a page already half legible. Then, when wind throws a tone across the water, an informed listener can smile and say, "That is the harbor speaking the language of its structure." A respectful nod can be given to those who prefer to call it something else. There is room enough in the bay for more than one way to listen. Over the years, hurricanes have also written their signatures across the shoreline. Storm surges rearrange sand and debris. When storms pass, the harbor is not the same as it was before. The changes can uncover features for a time, only to hide them again with the next cycle. Archaeologists pay attention to these pulses, sometimes gaining access to areas otherwise buried. Local fishers and divers often note such patterns first. Their knowledge is not footnoted in journals, but it is real and valued. Community knowledge and academic knowledge are strongest together. That partnership, polite, practical, and attentive, has been one of Port Royal's quiet successes. In the broader context of Caribbean ports, Port Royal's story resonates with other places where water and commerce met on fragile ground. Some settlements perched on river deltas, others on barrier islands, others on reclaimed marsh. Each made a bet against the sea and the earth. Some won for a long time, some lost in a moment. The fame of Port Royal's collapse does not come only from its speed or from its moralizing nicknames. It comes from the peculiar combination of catastrophe and preservation. Not many places that fell so quickly left behind rooms, arranged as if their owners might step back in. This combination allows a rare kind of education, the close-up of a life interrupted. That intimacy can feel uncanny. Keeping it gentle, steady, and factual preserves dignity. For those who collect stories within families, Port Royal often holds a corner. A grandparent's grandparent may have spoken of a visit to the Giddy House, or of a boat ride past the fort, when sailors pointed and said a street lay under that water. Oral history knits the present to the past in a way printed pages cannot match. Where possible, bringing those family threads into recorded history strengthens both museums and community centers that welcome such contributions find their exhibits thickening with the texture of lived experience. A city that once lived on trade continues to trade, in this case, trading time for attention, memory for care. As the script draws toward a closing, a final comparison can be made. One that suits the calm voice and the slow pace. Consider a conch shell held to the ear. It does not hold the sea inside. It gathers and shapes the sound of the room and returns it as a low rush. People call that sound the ocean because it feels right. Port Royal is a conch shell of history. It gathers the wind, the tide, the weight of old bricks, the habits of listening, and the stories told by neighbors, and it returns them as a murmuring echo. Those who wish to hear the ocean in it will hear the ocean. Those who wish to hear physics will hear physics. Those who wish to hear both will hear both without contradiction. And those who wish to hear the voices of people long gone will hear care speaking on their behalf through the work of archaeology and memory. The city still screams, if that word must stand, because the world under the water is not silent. The noises are real, and so is the impulse to make meaning from them. Calling them ghosts is a way to keep the past present. Explaining them is a way to honor the past by understanding it. The best tribute to those who lived there, and to those who died on that June morning, is not to stage fright, but to stage comprehension. A harbor that taught sailors to read wind and tide can teach anyone to read sand and sound. Thanks are rightly given to the people who anchor this story. The residents who carry Port Royal in their daily lives. The divers who survey with care. The conservators who turn fragile wood into safe exhibits. The teachers who frame hard truths without harshness. The visitors who come not to conquer, but to learn. There is always another harbor to study, another drowned street to map, another ledger to read. But here in this small corner of Jamaica, standing water keeps a library open under a surface that looks at first glance like any other bit of sea. That calm, that ordinariness is the setting for something extraordinary. the chance to hear history breathing in a voice as steady as the tide. In Port Royal, the past isn't past. It's just underwater,